Good afternoon. The reason for this press conference is because we have come to a point where we have been able to release the audio footage that we have and the video footage that we have of the incident involving Mr. Anthony Ware. And as a result of that, I realized that while the information that we've put out will answer some questions, it's going to create a lot more questions. And so today's press conference is about trying to answer those questions and further our effort to be as transparent as possible about what happened involving Mr. Ware. But before I get started and take your questions, I do want to let you know that I had an opportunity this morning to meet with the family once again and review the video with them, let them see what we had. They listened to the audio as well. We answered questions that they had, and they were understandably emotional and upset by some of the things that they heard and some of the things that they saw. But that's understandable given the fact that they lost a loved one, and so nobody can fault them for that. I also, once again, offer my condolences to them, and I hope that by doing what we're doing today, that this will begin the healing process in our community so that we can move forward and also build some bridges that need to be repaired in our communities, between law enforcement and our communities. One of the things that the family asked me to do was to mention that they need assistance with the funeral of Mr. Anthony Ware. They've set up a GoFundMe account, and the GoFundMe account that they've set up says funeral costs for Anthony Ware, and it's under the name of Tanya Young. And what the family told me during my conversation with them is that there have been has been at least one bogus account that was set up by some individual that was attempting to take advantage of this situation and actually make money. They are in desperate need of funds to help bury their loved one. So if you can get that message out to the public for me and for the family, I would greatly appreciate it, and I'm most certain that they would greatly appreciate it as well. Now, having said all of that, I will open the floor up to any questions that you have.
Chief, what do you think about the way your officers conducted themselves after you looked at the video from beginning to end?
I believe that they conducted themselves in a very professional manner. Obviously, and we're going to just address the elephant in the room, obviously, there's going to be some people that are going to be offended by some of the language that's used in the video. But what I want everybody to know is that if they pay a close attention to the language that's used, that language is directed at the other officers, and it's directed by an officer that's in a vehicle by himself, and he's just venting his frustration. Now, there are other times when officers use curse words at some point in time throughout the videos that you have access to, but even in those situations, from the best of my memory, I don't think those curse words were addressed to any of the citizens that gathered in the wake of what was happening or to Mr. Ware himself.
I haven't had a chance to listen to it fully. I'm not sure if any of the other media in here have. Were there any racial slurs heard in any audio, and if so, was any of it coming from any of your officers?
I did not hear any and have not heard any racial slurs. I've listened to the audio and watched the videos a number of times, and I have not heard any racial overtone from any of the officers.
Are there any specific reactions you can give from the family? I know you said they were disturbed, but was there anything specific they pointed out to you about what they saw in the video?
They talked about some of the things that the officers said that they found offensive regarding the officers' conversation about going on vacation and things of that nature. They thought that that was offensive. There was a point in time when the officers are doing CPR on Mr. Ware, and you hear a popping sound, and the officers make a comment about that, and one of the officers gives a chuckle, and they brought that up. And as I've explained to them, the information about the vacation and what they were going to be doing after all of this was over was before they realized the condition that Mr. Ware was actually in and that he actually needed medical attention. Once they realized that he was in a traumatic situation and needed medical attention, they shifted their attention, the playing back and forth and the light banter that was going back and forth between the officers stopped, and they tried to do everything that they could to save Mr. Ware's life. As far as the chuckle of the officer that was doing CPR when you heard the popping sound, I've never done CPR on an actual individual before. I've practiced it many times over my 21 years here at the police department. But it's my understanding that if you perform CPR correctly, chest compressions, you may fracture or crack the person's ribs. And when the officer did that, it startled him. And once it startled him, the more experienced officer that happened to be an EMT or experienced in medical emergency training, Officer King informed him of that. And he kind of chuckled, in my opinion, because it was just a nervous laughter and he was getting that nervous energy out. I don't think it was meant to be disrespectful to Mr. Ware or his family in any way.
There's a minute or two after Ware stopped responding where officers, I think, mentioned that he might be just not cooperating and he's not having a medical emergency. Can you speak to just that and how suspects can sometimes prefer to go to the hospital instead of the jail?
Yes, many times when we deal with individuals that we take into custody, especially if we've had to chase them or if we've had to use any amount of force against them, whether it be OC spray or physical force to overcome their resistance, many times the suspects will pretend that they're injured and that they need medical attention and prefer to try to go to the hospital rather than the county jail. They do this quite often, and usually they'll do it because they feel like if they go to the hospital, with the length of time that they may be at the hospital, that the officers who have made the arrest of them may get tired of waiting on them at the hospital and may do what's called an OR bond and release them on a signature bond and let them go, or that it's going to create some time before they actually have to go to the jail and buy them some time, I guess, if somebody's trying to come up with some money for them. So that would limit their time. And it appears that the officers felt that Mr. Ware was trying to do that. And that was what the conversation was about not taking him to the hospital. Early on, before that, or shortly before that, you hear the officers talking, and they're talking about who's going to transport Mr. Ware. If Mr. Ware had been unresponsive, that would not have been a conversation. The conversation would have been about getting rescued out there. So they're talking about who's going to transport him, and they're trying to figure out who has a cage in their vehicle. And Officer King had the cage, and she was going to be the one that transported Mr. Ware. Also, there's a point in the video when there's a conversation where she asked for rescue early on before the actual medical emergency itself, and she tells the dispatcher that they're just going to walk him out to her vehicle and rescue can meet him there. So that indicates that he did not have a medical emergency immediately following his contact with officers, but this was on set at some point in time after the contact, but not immediately.
Upon reviewing the situation, from your standpoint, was there any point that Mr. Ware indicated verbally or non-verbally that he was in any sort of respiratory distress or that he was experiencing a medical emergency?
In talking to the officers, they have indicated that he either told them at one point in time that he was having shortness of breath or difficulty breathing, and that's why Officer King initially called for rescue. And that is not uncommon that a person may have shortness of breath or difficulty breathing if they have run a distance and struggled with officers and been sprayed with OC spray. So that would not be anything that would necessarily raise an alarm or red flag immediately.
I know we talked about this a little bit before, but why is there no video, body camera, or otherwise of him actually being pepper sprayed?
The initial officers that responded to the location, Officer King, Officer Dawkins, Officer Snow, and Officer Cameron, none of them had body cameras. It's not that they have body cameras and they were assigned body cameras. They have not been assigned body cameras. We have 286 officers here at the Tuscaloosa Police Department, and only 60 or so of those officers have body cameras. Due to budgetary restraints, we have not been able to outfit our entire department with body cameras, but we are in the process of doing that and have been in the process of doing that since 2012.
I know it's hard to look back and say what if, but now that you see this video, is there anything you wish had been done differently or anything you think the officer should have done differently?
Well, and this came from Officer King in a conversation that she had with Sergeant Blankley on last night. She is a trained EMT, and we have another officer here at the police department that is a trained EMT. And she mentioned that if she had had an AED, that maybe things could have been different and they may have been able to save Mr. Ware, but unfortunately they didn't have access to that. And so that's one of the recommendations, and even in my conversation with her on last night, that is a great idea, and that is something that I'm going to fight to get implemented, that the 2 EMT trained officers that we have will get AED so that we can be better prepared to deal with a situation like this in the future.
Chief, in other parts of the country where there have been incidents involving police and the public and people have died, we've seen protests in some places, riots in others, and sometimes hardly ever anything happen. Why in Tuscaloosa does it seem like we haven't seen some of the anger and unrest that we've seen in other cities?
I don't want to lead anybody and mislead anybody into thinking that we're out of the woods with respect to having any type of protest, because I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball to tell you what's going to happen from this point forward. What I can tell you is that I hope that people honestly believe that we're being as transparent as possible throughout this whole process, and that we're doing everything that we can to reassure not only Mr. Ware's family, but our community, that we're committed to protecting and serving the people who live in our community, and that we're not out here to do them any harm. And I think if you watch the footage, the video footage, you will see that we had officers that went out with a specific purpose to apprehend a wanted individual that was possibly armed with a handgun, and that individual fled from them. And they went out in one mode to take a person into custody, and they later on did everything that they could to try to save that individual's life. They struggled trying to get him up out of that depression which he had gone down into. The officers were physically exhausted from CPR and trying to save Mr. Ware's life. And so I hope that people will take that away from the video, that these officers out here, although they started out with one goal in mind when they first encountered Mr. Ware, at the end of it, their goal has shifted to saving his life. And I think that if people will pay attention to that and truly look at all of the facts that we have, and this is all that we have, we don't have anything else, that they'll recognize that we had no malice toward Mr. Ware, and we certainly meant him no harm.
What do things stand in the investigation? Do you now have an autopsy and a cause of death for Anthony Ware?
An autopsy was conducted on Monday, but I do not have any results from the autopsy. Hopefully, and we have asked them to expedite the autopsy, hopefully that will be something that will be done and we'll have that expedited. I'm confident that once the autopsy is done, that the autopsy will show that Mr. Ware was not shot, as had been previously reported in the community, and Mr. Ware was not tased to death, as had been previously reported, that his skull was not caved in or fractured, and I'm positive that there will be no injuries that are caused by the officers that resulted in his death.
There's a reader has emailed me about a moment in the video where officers tell each other to stay off the radio after they realize that Ware is in distress. Is that just to keep the channels clear so there can be clear communication between the supervisor and dispatch and rescue?
Yes, when the officers tell the other officers to stay off the air, it's because they need the air for their emergency that they have going on at that particular point in time, and they don't want anybody taking up the airspace with something that's not important at that time. And as you go through the video, there is going to be a time when there's another officer that's working at another location in the city that will get on the air, and you will hear an officer make a comment, and it will be some cursing in that comment, and it will be a derogatory comment about that particular officer being on the air. But that's why they asked for the air to be cleared.
I know there are a lot of unanswered questions still. When do you think you might have more answers as to what transpired that evening?
Well, the investigators are continuing to do their investigation. They're continuing to talk to witnesses as they come forward, as they identify witnesses and get statements from them. And that's what their job is. It's not my job to interfere in that. And so I don't want people to think that that's what I'm doing at this particular point in time by putting this video out here or holding this press conference. I'm in no way trying to interfere with the investigation. All I'm doing is trying to be transparent and show you what we have at this point. The investigators are doing their job. The ME is going to do his job and do the autopsy and give us a report back. So once the investigation is completed and we have the autopsy report and we have all the information that's needed, that information will then be turned over to the district attorney, and the district attorney will present that information to a grand jury to hear. And at that particular time, whatever the grand jury rules will be what we abide by.
In other cases, outside agencies like the ABI have been involved. Why is it just the county homicide unit this time?
Well, and I certainly can't speak for the ABI, but based on the realignment of the state police in the state of Alabama and the limited resources that they have, we felt that it would be better suited just to ask a neighboring jurisdiction to do the investigation.
Chief, without an autopsy report that's complete and public, how can you say your officers didn't play a role in Anthony Ware's death?
They didn't do anything physically that I'm aware of to hurt Mr. Ware. I've talked to them. They didn't mention anything about beating him up. They didn't shoot him or tase him to death, and that's why I say I'm certain that the autopsy will prove that they're telling the truth.
Last question. Any other questions? All right, thank you.
Thank y'all. And please remember the GoFundMe account. Please, if you don't mention anything else that I've said in this press conference, do the family a favor and do me a favor and mention their funeral costs for Anthony Ware, Tanya Young at GoFundMe, please. Thank you.